this kind of came a little bit out of nowhere, but it makes sense if you consider Olaf Scholz's domestic political situation and, of course, Trump's election. Olaf Scholz had a phone call with Putin today where they discussed a bunch of things, including, it was over an hour long. They discussed what an end result of the war would look like, where the Russians were talking about the territorial realities of the ground, while the Germans were condemning their actions. While generally speaking, it was done because Scholz wants to find some passageway, possibly towards negotiations. But the positions between the two camps are still wide different apart. I don't know if it's as wide as Kiev's differences with Moscow. I would hope so. I would hope that there would be some unity in this, unity in the coalition, but the differences are still wide. And plus, the Russians are asking for more territory still in the deal, while not making, as far as I'm aware, any concessions on, like, well, we'll trade this for Kursk. It seems to be the same. We want Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and we, of course, want Crimea. So it's the same demands as before when it comes to territorial demands of the annexations. Now, let's read a little bit about what was discussed in the phone call. Let's talk about why it happened, if it's smart policy, and we'll then move on to the Ukrainian reaction, because Zelensky is not happy. Russia's Vladimir Putin and Chancellor Olaf Scholz held a phone call Friday as the German leader urged the president to enter talks with Ukraine to end the war. The call, the first direct communication between the leaders in almost 2 years, comes at a critical time for Kiev as the war-battered nation braces for the third full winter under attack from Russia, with large parts of the country's energy infrastructure damaged or destroyed. And as I was coming under today into the Kiev bunker studio, we got another air alert as there's another air attack going on, and the Russians have been storing up missiles, and I think they've been storing up to use them as winter gets as cold as possible and to fire them off. I can't say I know that for sure, but the Russians have a record. The Chancellor called on Russia's willingness to negotiate with Ukraine with the aim of a just and lasting peace, Scholz spokesman Stefan Hebestreit said on a statement on Friday. Uncertainty over support from Western allies has been growing ahead of Donald Trump's return to the White House next year. Germany is Ukraine's second biggest supporter after the United States and has pledged billions of dollars in additional aid. Scholz, who condemned Russia's war of aggression, addressed in particular Moscow's aerial attacks on civilian infrastructure and called the deployment of North Korean troops a grave escalation in the 2.5-year war, according to officials. The decline to be identified in line with German protocol. Scholz and Putin agreed to remain in contact, the official said. The phone call was first reported by Bloomberg News on Friday. The Kremlin confirmed the exchange, saying in a statement that Putin noted that Russia has never refused and remained open to talks, which it stated were interrupted by Kyiv. Any agreement must take into account Russia's security interests, including new territorial realities, it said in the statement, which to me seems like a desire, or seems like a signal towards the annexation of Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Luhansk. The Russian statement called the conversation detailed and frank, with Putin reinforcing his position that the crisis is due to NATO's aggressive policy. Scholz this year signaled his readiness to make direct contact with Putin for the first time since December of 2022, ahead of the Group of 20 Leaders Summit in Brazil. But he stressed that he would liaise closely with the U.S. and European allies ahead of any such phone call. Okay, so first let's talk about the topics of discussion, and then we'll talk about why the conversation happened in the first place. Okay, one thing, North Korean troops being a grave escalation. Okay, it's a grave escalation. At what point is there going to be a statement of, you've done this, you go any further, and we will do this? Or because you've done this, we are going to do this. And if you do anything else, we will then do this. If you just say, man, chief, I don't like that, that's not good. And let me be clear, this specific movement and escalation by the Russians for the rest of Europe is more important than the attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. It's more important than the attack on Ukrainian dams that lead to flooding, or the attack on their agricultural industry, or even attacks on civilians. Not saying it's not morally important. It's not important to Ukraine. When we talk about the long-term strategic implications for Europe, the normalization of Asian troops entering a European space and invading a European nation, the largest nation constrained entirely within Europe, I mean, that's big. That's big. And if it's a successful model for the Russians in Ukraine, why could something like that not be extended to, say, I don't know, Moldova? Or say, I don't know, Georgia, Armenia, or, God willing it will not happen, a NATO country, starting a gigantic war, which will be a disaster for everyone, and will lead to many deaths. You don't want to normalize this type of behavior. This is two countries invading Ukraine now, even if it's done under Russian command structure. And if that is being normalized here, then it could rationally, if it works for the North Koreans and it works for the Russians, be extended elsewhere. And so, yes, I think Germany has an interest in making the Russians know that introducing other nations and invading Europe and breaking European peace needs to be disincentivized. It needs to be disincentivized not with just words, but actions. Because the Germans certainly have expressed words, and a lot of words, and more words. Okay, that's the first thing. Condemning the war of aggression, I think it might be like, really, of course, like a formality, in order to, signal to the people who, of course, don't like the idea of Scholz and Putin talking that, oh, see, he's being tough. Particularly on civilian infrastructure. I mean, this is interesting. Again, it's a question of what will you do? If you just condemn aerial attacks on civilian infrastructure, but you're not willing to make investments or moves when those escalate. For example, we have more Shaheed attacks on civilian infrastructure than ever. We've had strikes on children's cancer hospitals. And if strikes on children's cancer hospitals are not going to allow long-range strikes on those air bases from which they were conducted, then I don't think there's any moral ground that they're going to do that policy change on. Outside of that, I think I want to talk about quickly the Kremlin statements on this, which is, number one, that they were always open and we remain open, etc., etc. To be clear, at multiple times during the war, the Kremlin said there was no point in negotiations. So that doesn't really sound like remains open, right? Never refused, maybe you could try to say, but remains open, I don't know about that, Chief. Also, when they say the talks were interrupted by Kyiv, I think they were interrupted by the invasion and then you face planting, not by Kyiv. I think if you guys invaded and you were the Russia that they show in the movies and not the Russia that we saw in February of 2022, then I think probably negotiations would have continued. But, I mean, you weren't. Sorry, Chief. As for the new territorial realities, to me, this seems like them openly hinting that, look, we have this land. It's our land. You have to acknowledge it's our land if you want it to be peace. But I would even go further that if they're calling for Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and they've already annexed it under the Russian constitution, they very much would like to still take the rest of it. To me, it's like taking Zaporizhia would be very difficult, I imagine. Taking Kherson, crossing that river, it's going to be, I mean, good luck. So if there was a demand to give those cities up, it would have to be acknowledged that we are giving up cities that the Ukrainians, for all intents and purposes, for the short to medium term, unless something changes, can very, very easily defend. I mean, we're talking about changes of like 0.08% of occupation every month still. And that's the escalation. That's the giant increase in the amount of territory that's being occupied every month, right? These are cities of hundreds of thousands of people. And if that's going to be demanded in negotiations, that's a ridiculous demand. That's a ridiculous demand, and one that the Ukrainians cannot secede to. If the Ukrainians start saying, sorry, we're going to evacuate Zaporizhia, we're going to evacuate Kramatorsk, we're going to evacuate Slovyansk, we're going to evacuate Kherson, we're going to evacuate Konstantinivka, we're going to take all the people from these cities, and we're going to move them because, I'm sorry, we got to... The domestic reaction to that will be aggressive. I won't get into any more detail than that, but aggressive. And much worse than if they were to even just freeze the front line, which will still come with extremely negative responses as people say, why did we invade Kursk? What do we have this land for? Trade it for the land. What do you mean we have to give up Kursk for nothing? Why did we fight that battle? Why did we lose those men? Which, of course, would be the same topic for the time that they retook Kherson. Retaking Kherson, then giving it up doesn't make any sense. So I'm interested to know if they still believe that they're going to annex all of the land that they declared that they were annexing and including in their country through the Constitution, or if it's just the land that they hold on to. And even then, there's a question of land for land trades of Kursk. And I'm framing it from the German perspective here, by the way. I'm not framing it from the Ukrainian perspective of, bleeding them out slowly to be able to take even more land, but I'm framing it out from an Olaf Scholz who wants peace possibly early or soon, so it could help him politically, domestically. So let's move into that. Olaf Scholz is not popular in Germany. As the leader of the traffic light coalition, he has seen the SPD under his watch and his personal popularity and approval rating continue to go down and down and down, and we've seen no hint of reversal whatsoever. And so Scholz, seeing this decrease, seeing the increase of support for these news parties like the BSW, and which is a left-leaning party which is against aid for Ukraine, and of course the rise of the AfD, and then you have Olaf Scholz's party, which has some people who are, let's say, softer on the war. They do have people who are softer, dovish on the war within the SPD. And then you have your opponents, the CDU, who are much more hawkish. I don't know much more, but are at least more hawkish. I think this is an attempt by Olaf Scholz to not only show himself as a leader doing leadership things, making a phone call. I mean, look at what they posted online. And this is the type of stuff you post online. It was like, look at me, I am the leader. I spoke to President Putin on the phone and called on him to end the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and to withdraw his troops. Russia must show willingness to negotiate with Ukraine with the aim of achieving a just and lasting peace. And then the picture is him with his advisors, thinking of, what do we do here? What do we do here? As they talk and, go through the bullet points. He looks very leaderly. And I think that's part of the purpose. But also, if he could somehow, now with a new Washington administration who wants a deal, at least from everything they've publicly signaled, if Olaf Scholz could be part of making that deal, maybe that could reverse his political fortunes for the snap election that's going to happen in Germany on February 24th, because the traffic light coalition of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Social Liberal FDP has collapsed due to Christian Lindner, his finance minister, being pretty hardcore on don't take that, don't take that, don't take that, even if it means not sending more aid to Ukraine. And not to mention, Olaf Scholz has publicly signaled towards the idea that Ukraine is affecting Germany's economic prosperity, not the Russians invading Ukraine. I guess that's part. I'm being a little bad faith, a tiny bit bad faith, but I really didn't like that statement. I didn't like that statement, and I think it didn't show the signal that needs to be shown diplomatically. But it might be the signal that he wants to show domestically in order to try to see if he can salvage this election come February 24th, which he is almost certain to lose, and then have the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, Merkel's old party, which is more hawkish on this. I know saying Merkel's party is more hawkish on this is a little wild, but it's 2024, it's not 2017 anymore. He does not want that to transpire, and so he wants to win. So he wants to look leaderly. If he was able to get some sort of a peace, that would be obviously a big plus for him, and it would probably be at least some amount of a plus for the German economy if it meant the reopening of the gas imports, which who knows how that would transpire. Point is, he's rolling the dice on this diplomatic initiative, I think largely for domestic political reasons. I think that there might be other German economic reasons that they might want this war to end if they could, because they do have a budget shortfall, and if they could have cheaper gas, that would probably help them. And if they could import that gas from Germany, that would probably help them, even if, of course, your immediate security priorities rank higher than the price of gasoline. But I think these domestic political concerns are at play. I also think, on the other hand, that because Donald Trump has been talking so much about this deal, and we already know that it's been I say we know, but it's been reported by the Washington Post, but denied by the Kremlin, that there was a Trump-Putin phone call, and Trump supposedly told him not to escalate, and they started initial talks over what the end of this war could possibly look like. I think the Europeans don't want to be seeing Donald Trump negotiating over their heads. Or when I say the Europeans, I mean Olaf Scholz here in this example. And so if talks are happening, they would like to be involved. Of course, Ukraine would need to be involved in any negotiation. You do not negotiate over the heads of the Ukrainians, but the Europeans also don't want to have their heads negotiated over, since the Russians are their neighbor. They're kind of our neighbor too, when you see how close they are to Alaska, but they're much more when it comes to, you know, proximity and like where they could actually do damage. You can't really do an invasion into Alaska that easily from, you know, Vladivostok. It's much more their neighbor. It's much more in their backyard. And so they don't want to be excluded from the table, and Olaf Scholz doesn't want to be excluded from the table. And so that could be the diplomatic reasoning. Now, I will say that I don't see really what this achieved. And I think the odds are this will achieve very little. It's not impossible, but I think it will achieve very little. I do think that Olaf Scholz... How do I put this? The German government needs to be able to show, as Ukraine's second largest backer, that they're in the trenches until the end. And maybe he could have hinted that in the call. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but the more aid that it looks like Germany and the West is willing to pump into Ukraine, the more likely the Germans, and over longer periods, the more likely the Russians are going to say, okay, we can't really deal with that long-term of a war. We got these economic domestic problems with oil refineries not turning profits, the ruble losing its value, Russians not having the same consumer power that they used to, and free spending money, and it's affecting them at the dinner table. And of course, there's the amount of lives that are being lost, which people are not exactly excited about in Russia. And therefore, that pressure, the fact that they are looking down the abyss of 2 years of slamming their head against Ukrainian entrenchments, reinforced with European weapons, and possibly European continent that would be willing to escalate where they escalate. For example, they send North Korean troops, and then you got French troops training Ukrainian troops in the West, or manning air defense systems in Western Ukraine. That's just a proposal. I'm not saying that's being too widely in public talked about, but that's just an example. And so if Scholz put that forward in this discussion, and that was the image he was really putting through, then maybe it couldn't be that bad. But the talks in December of 2022 accomplished very little. The talks before the war accomplished very little. And I think the odds are, and maybe this is just pattern recognition, that this talk will result in very, very little. Zelensky does have a response to this, and I wanted to show you guys that response. I'll read part of the response, and then we'll listen to Zelensky. The Chancellor told our president he plans to talk to Putin. The president said this would only help Putin by reducing his isolation, as in Zelensky said this. Putin doesn't want real peace, he wants a break. Talking to him will let Putin change the scenery and keep the war going. It won't bring peace because Putin will just repeat the lies he's been telling for years, making it seem like he's no longer isolated. And here is Zelensky expressing this himself. I will read the subtitles for those listening over audio. I wish you health, fellow Ukrainians. Briefly about today, we continue to work on the points of our internal resilience plan. So the Ukrainians said that next week, Zelensky said that next week they're going to release an internal resilience plan that's separate from the victory plan that they presented to the West. That's for domestic Ukrainian issues. For example, solving the manpower or addressing the manpower problem. I don't think they'll ever solve it, but addressing the manpower problem, trying to expand Ukrainian domestic production, keeping energy afloat, stuff that they can do on their own to improve their own resilience, instead of just, the victory plan, which largely was aimed towards allies and trying to rev up their support. Today, two fundamental points were covered. The front line and human capital. Everything related to our defense. And everything related to our people. Military and civilian. Adults and children. The goal is clear. It is our defense against Russian aggression right now and everything we must do to ensure that we do not lose the post-war peace. To preserve and strengthen our people, both the state and the people. It is imperative. Today, I continued our international work, informal diplomacy. I spoke with university students in Latin America. People in all parts of the world must equally understand what is needed now to restore peace and international relations. And one more thing. Regarding one of today's news stories, this is the important part. Chancellor Scholz told me that he is going to call Putin. It is true that Scholz called Zelensky first to tell him that he was going to do this call. Zelensky did advise him against it. Olaf's call, in my opinion, is a Pandora's box. Now there may be other conversations, other calls, just a lot of words. And this is what exactly Putin has wanted for a long time. It is crucial for him to weaken his isolation, Russia's isolation, and to engage in negotiations, ordinary negotiations, that will lead to nothing. And as he has been doing for decades, this allowed Russia to change nothing in its policy, to do nothing substantial, and ultimately it led to this war. We understand all these changes now. We know how to act. And we want to warn everyone. There will be no Minsk III. That we need a real peace. Glory to Ukraine. So, I do want to throw out one other thing that really grinds my gears about this call, about the potential effectiveness of this call. Scholz is probably a lame duck prime minister. The odds of him getting reelected is tremendously low. And the odds of the SPD winning the election also tremendously low. So I keep saying prime minister. Chancellor. Sorry, we were just talking about a different prime minister. Chancellor. If he's not going to get reelected, what power does he really have in negotiations with the Russians if he's going to be out in 3 months? I think, honestly, they're expecting and waiting for the next administration and to make deals with them, since the current government, the Traffic Light Coalition, collapsed due to the FDP and Christian Lindner. And so talking to Scholz, if anything, I think it could really just be like a propaganda coup to show the Russian domestic public and the world, like, hey, it's actually okay to come over here and talk to the Russians in this way and, talk about making a deal here, a deal there, instead of trying to show a unified coalition. These bilateral kind of conversations might be okay. And people maybe breaking with the coalition might be okay. Of course, I don't think that's what this was, a break of the coalition, necessarily. But that's a signal that someone could maybe take from this, or something that could be pushed in that direction. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen or that's particularly likely to happen. What I am saying, though, is that if he's a lame duck who's not going to have power in 3 months, what exactly can he accomplish from negotiations right now? I don't know. I think very little. Also, just to kind of re-emphasize the importance of the war to Germany, if Ukraine was to collapse, those refugees would be heading straight to Germany. And if Germany has learned anything from the last few years, it's probably not that the German public wants more refugees. How many? Actually, here it is. 10 million is the official refugee estimate. 2 million of them to Germany. Unofficial, up to 18 million, 3 to 4 million to Germany. This is a briefing from the Federal Civil Protection Agency. By the way, I'm looking at chat right now, and we have a guy in there called Pigger Homo, and I'm just gonna go on a branch here and say that name is. I'm gonna put them as center left, social liberal. Is that I think a Clinton, I think they voted for Hillary. I think they voted for Hillary in 2016, then they wrote in Hillary in 2020, and then they put in Chelsea Clinton for 2024 because it was her turn.